Get ready for Netflix's gripping new medical drama, Pulse. Set in a cutting-edge Miami trauma center, third-year resident Dr. Danny Sims is unexpectedly thrust into a promotion when beloved chief resident Dr. Xander Phillips gets suspended. Then, with the emotional and physical stakes at their highest, a storm will push the hospital and its residents to their limits. Witness how life can change in a heartbeat when you're operating under pressure. Watch Pulse April 3rd, only on Netflix.
On today's episode of the Retro Gamers Podcast, Dave and Chris from Two Middle-Aged Guys Trying to Work It All Out stop by to debate who won the biggest console war in the 90s, the Super Nintendo or the SEGA Genesis. Hello everyone and welcome to the Retro Gamers Podcast, episode 407. Anthony here, and as you can see, joined by Two Middle-Aged Guys Trying to Work It All Out, Chris and Dave. Thank you for joining me for this episode.
Happy to be here.
Thank you for having us.
How are you guys doing?
Oh, good. I'm jealous of your T-shirt.
Yep.
I mean, I did think we trademarked middle age. Turns out
true.
we didn't.
Nope. Stole it.
Trademark something that has existed since the beginning of language. Although I guess in the olden days we would be considered probably near immortal at our age. I think the life expectancy was like 8.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
we did put the TM on the end of ours, even though it's not valid and doesn't apply to anything. However, you will get a cease and desist letter from us.
We're breaking many laws.
All right. Well, send me the cease and desist. I have a paper shredder just waiting for it.
Oh, yes. I would expect nothing else. In fact, I'd be disappointed if you responded to it, took it seriously.
Oh no, I would respond to it. I would actually send you the video of me shredding it.
Oh, okay. I was hoping you would send us the TurboGrafx box.
No, I wouldn't give you anything that cool.
Is that the actual box or is that the mini?
No, that's the mini behind me.
Okay, all right. I mean, the mini's really big.
It's one of the larger minis. I think that one and the Commodore 64 mini were like two of the largest ones.
So they had to get that, the keyboard, even if it's not a functional keyboard. So we are talking about, I don't want to steal your thunder. No, but we're talking about the 16-bit era today.
We are.
Which includes the TurboGrafx. So we're going to dive right in and have a deep discussion specifically on TurboGrafx, right?
No, actually, if that I don't think you got the memo, but if that's what you prepared, you are going to be woefully disappointed. Yes. Well, any excuse you can make to slide the TurboGrafx into our discussion, feel free. We'll just completely ignore it and continue on with the topic we're talking about today, which is the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, and the SEGA Genesis, that age-old battle, that 90s battle that was absolutely epic in the video game era. Completely, I don't think there were two other consoles that you can really compare as much as these two. Like, this was really like the two giants going at each other.
It launched the
console wars. Yeah.
It did.
Yeah.
It defined the term.
Mm-hmm. It really did define the console wars. And speaking of the console wars, I don't know if you've ever read Blake Harris's book, but I have it right here.
I have read it. Yeah, it's excellent.
It's one I've not read.
Excellent book. I would love to say that I remember all of it, but I remember probably very little. Again, once middle age happens, like my shirt says, I think you just naturally forget everything. Doesn't matter what it is. It's like you have about like a 6-month window, and then it's out of your head. And I'm being gratuitous with the 6 months.
You flush the RAM.
Yeah, you basically, you flush the RAM, you reinstall back to factory settings, and then which means I got to read it again. But Blake Harris, Console Wars, excellent book. I remember reading it several years ago, and it really lays out everything that happens between Sega and Nintendo during their console wars. But what we're talking about is our own personal experiences with the console wars, what we thought of Super Nintendo and Sega. And by the end of this episode, we will make the definitive decision. Which one is the better console?
Oh, I didn't know that. I mean, we're getting into like almost quasi-religious debates here. This is like, there's going to be a schism that, we could have factions developing. We could reignite the console war. Many died. The console war and the cola wars of the 80s were, I mean, really, very deadly.
It was the basis of Mad Max. I don't know if you were aware of that.
Oh,
I wasn't aware of that. It was all started by Coke versus Pepsi, and then it escalated with Nintendo versus Sega.
Yeah,
I thought it's what inspired Kevin Smith's movie Dogma.
You're again. I haven't read Console Wars. I've never watched Dogma.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to go to hell. I don't know. Oh, now, great.
And with that, we are doomed.
Yes. I don't know who's we. Kimosabi.
Well, you know what? I've been doomed since a very, very long time, and you know what? I own it. I'm happy with that. But
I just said Kimosabi. I've been canceled. I said it twice.
That's okay.
I'm the only person authorized to speak on this podcast. I think that's what it's boiling down to.
Which is great considering it's my podcast. So, Chris, you know what? I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Fantastic. So, let's start off, Anthony, with your experiences with the SNES and the Sega Genesis. Did you own both of them? Did you have one first? What was your impressions as a young Anthony going into this console war?
Okay, so young Anthony was we don't want to get into my psyche back then, but getting into the consoles themselves, if I remember correctly, I had the Super Nintendo first, which is, great interesting considering the fact that the Genesis came out 2 years prior. Genesis came out in '89, but I remember because Nintendo was so awesome and I loved my NES, it just made sense to go straight to a Super Nintendo. I didn't have a Sega Master System, so my experience with Sega at that time was nothing. So the Genesis really didn't hit my radar until later on. I did wind up owning them both, but I definitely had the Super Nintendo first. I can't recall how long I had a Super Nintendo before I got a Genesis, and I'm pretty sure the impetus for me getting a Genesis was Sonic and any wrestling games that were on the Genesis. Because at the time, again, both consoles were doing so well that a lot of games wound up getting duplicated, but there were some differences. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I think that was the impetus for me getting a Genesis. So I did have them both. I loved them both for completely different reasons. And even to this day, like going back and looking at both of them, like I still have like fond memories, and pitting them against each other is difficult for me because I enjoyed them both as young Anthony. So I'm gonna turn it over to Dave to give us his recollection.
So I got my Nintendo, the NES late, and I was in love with it. And Chris got the Sega Genesis, and I've told this story before, and I am truly not. I mean, it's one of those things that it's probably apocryphal, and my memory has adjusted it. Memory is terrible, and I'm sure that this is not exactly how it happened, but I'm pretty sure I convinced you to trade me back. To trade me, you had your Genesis. You had an NES. You got a Genesis for Christmas. You got rid of your NES to get Genesis games, decided you wanted your NES, and traded me your Genesis for my NES. Now, is that close to the truth, or have I magnified it in some way? Or
I don't recall.
I remember your mom not being happy.
You are correct that I had the Genesis, and I got it first. While you were still NES, and even when SNES was on the market, I had the Genesis first. You are correct in that. I don't remember trading it to you because before the end of the cycle, I also owned both of them. Yeah. And so I can't imagine that I would have traded a Genesis and then reacquired a Genesis. Like that sounds beyond my means at that age.
I probably just have borrowed it, and
now it may have been something like we wanted to, and my mother put the kibosh on that and was like, "There's no way that's happening." Maybe it's something like that. But I'm afraid that my memory is not helping with this story either.
I was running a pawn shop as an 11-year-old, so that's probably how I got it. I sold a lot of gold, a lot of necklaces, and some Sega Genesises. I owned a Sega Genesis in the moment. or I borrowed one to the point of ownership. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. I did not have a Super Nintendo until much later, much later, right? Until like the PlayStation days.
Oh, wow.
So maybe even the end of the PlayStation days, I bought it as a when retro games had no value, and then I because I didn't own it, right? I thought, well, I can experience that. I did have family members who had it. Chris, I think I played yours. Played a lot of Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario World, Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario World. But I remember the Genesis. I remember when it first came out that the selling point was it was pitch perfect arcade. I mean, it was Altered Beast, which was the original Pac-Man game in '89. Regardless of what you think of the quality of that game, how it looked and played just like the arcade. So even if it wasn't that great of a game, it was as good a version of that game as you were going to get, and you had it at home, and it looked way better than anything the Nintendo had. So just like from that total, just the sheen of the arcade, it had it. The NES didn't, and of course everybody wanted it. That being said, I would make the argument that the Genesis didn't really get its juice until Sonic came out. And that sort of that weird 89 to 91, 92 period, that was just, Sega losing again to Nintendo, just like they lost with the Master System. But only when it went head to head with the SNES, with Sonic, did it actually have a chance of being of greatness. Before that, it was just really great arcade ports. It was a mediocre game like Altered Beast in its best form was just okay. Great games like Golden Axe, but one really awesome game doesn't make for a platform that you can build an entire generation off of on the back of. I don't think, right? And I'm not showing my hand here because I have a lot of fond memories of the Genesis, Sonic and post Sonic, when it got its absolutely that shot of adrenaline and the life came into it. And it actually had a real competitor in the Super Nintendo, and it wasn't competing against the Nintendo in a 3-year-old library of killer games and classics that I don't think anyone could eclipse. It had a little bit. I think at that point it was a little bit fairer of a fight, and that's set the context there with where I'm at. And I'll say this: blast processing. I'll get that out of the way. Somebody had to say it first.
Oh man, you stole my line for later. But anyway, Chris, what about you?
Yeah, he stole my line too. So we'll get him after the show. But yeah, I already spoiled a little bit responding to Dave, but I did have a Genesis first. But I did not have the Genesis until Sonic was the pack-in, and Sonic is what really made that decision for me because I was blown away by Sonic. I thought it was one of the most gorgeous games I'd ever seen. The speed of it was absolutely unmatched by anything Nintendo could do. And to Dave's point that that's when the Genesis really got its juice. That's also when Sega of America really took over the marketing of the Sega Genesis in the United States. And the marketing for the Genesis during this period of time was outstanding. And I think that really did a lot to help the Genesis out. But I had a Genesis, I had Sonic. I absolutely loved Sonic to death. Still do. It's one of my favorite games. But I had a real drought after that. I could not find another game that I was excited about on the Genesis for a very, very, very long time because unlike Dave, I was not interested in arcade perfect ports.
Yeah.
I was more the kid that wanted the story-driven games. I wanted the RPGs and the adventures and the ones that really had a plot that took you from A to B to C as opposed to just being a hit start, play for 5 minutes and then, rinse and repeat. Like that was not the experience I wanted, which was the only experience the Genesis had in the early years of its life. So very quickly I had the Genesis, but I was kind of upset that was the choice I made. I'm looking at my other friends with the Super Nintendo and thinking, oh man, what was I thinking? What did I do? Although I still loved Sonic and I played a ton of Sonic. But before we get any further, Dave, I want to know if you remember this, and I think Anthony, you'll appreciate this story. But at this point in our lives, we were kind of in separate camps. Like I was like, I've got a Genesis, I'm Team Genesis, and Dave was like, well, the Super Nintendo is obviously better. And so we had a debate about this that we researched for like a week. Do you remember this, Dave?
I don't remember it.
Okay.
I don't remember this at all.
So even to the point where you called Nintendo of America and you were like, "Hey, I'm doing some research about the Super Nintendo versus the Sega Genesis," and they sent you all like this huge data sheet of all these specs about what the hardware of the Super Nintendo did.
I do remember that.
And all I had prepared was what I heard on the commercial. Yeah, so I was like, well, it's faster than the Super Nintendo. So I got creamed in this debate.
You put on black sunglasses and screamed into my face. I think that was the Genesis marketing campaign was just
that literally was.
Yeah. And I thought that would win me the debate, but unfortunately we had your younger sister judge the debate, which maybe was not smart on my hand. I think there may have been some prejudice there. Yeah.
It would have went the other way.
But and rightfully so, you won the debate because you had facts and figures, and all I had was blast processing. So there we have it.
That's all you need.
That really is all you need. That is all you need. You just need it. You do need that and a tagline, right? That's all you need. So all right, that's all right. Really cool intros there. So good to get the background out of the way for all of us. I think
I want to mention one thing about Chris's early experience. One of your first games I remember you owning, Toe Jam and Earl.
Mm-hmm.
That did not help your case.
No, it didn't. And I enjoyed it at the time.
That didn't help. That was awesome.
It was
such a product of its time.
It was such a difficult game to like comprehend. Like, you're looking for, this is going to be like Sega's Mario. And then you put it in and you're like, what am I supposed to be doing? What is the format of this game? So it took me a long time to appreciate what was happening. But initially I bounced off of it and I was like, I don't understand what is happening here.
All right. Well, that's fair. I was a huge fan of Toe Jam and Earl, but I wouldn't have compared it to a Mario at all. It was more like
and it shouldn't have been compared to a Mario.
No, absolutely not.
That was my fault.
But all right, cool. So I think
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
What I want to do from here is to we'll go around. I think we'll take turns and pick. Let's start with the like the comparisons of a couple of games. And I think what we can do is we'll each take a turn and pick like either a game that was on both systems and talk about your memories of it, which one, if you did play them both, which one you thought was better, or pick something that would be like a comparable type of thing where it'd be like, Super Mario World versus Sonic the Hedgehog stuff. And we can just go around and kind of discuss, our preferences between them. And I think we'll start with Dave.
Well, I have reams of paper from Nintendo of America. I'll just read it.
Excellent.
I think that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Did you call the hotline to get that?
I did. I think that I did call the hotline to get that. That's the only way I could have that was the only road you had. I mean, it wasn't like I could
at the time. Yeah.
Web search it.
So instead of helping you with a game, you're just like, can I please get some data?
Send me a game. Now they would send you something.
Yes.
More just out of the cuteness, hoping that I would tell the story and I would get it,
they would probably send you a service bill.
Well, it's true. Yeah. We spent 4 hours researching this, $800.
Pretty much.
But you won that debate. That's all that matters.
That's all that matters. $800 win.
Right? I maybe in the moment I won it. So I think that we talked about launch titles a little bit. So I'll just do that, right? Because I think that's fair. The Genesis had the arcade perfect mediocrity of Altered Beast. Super Nintendo had Super Mario World, which is one of the greatest games ever made. I still think Mario 3 is probably a little bit better. Okay. And I think I've said this before, that Mario 3 from Mario All-Stars is the best of the Mario games, and that especially in the 2D era. But Nintendo came out with its best shot, and Sega came out with an arcade perfect port. But Sonic comes out and changes everything, because it plays faster than anything you've ever played before. And it has what I think is, even talking about it here, I've got the music stuck in my head. And I don't know if like the Michael Jackson composed the music thing is true. And I think that's actually more of a Sonic 2 thing than
it was Sonic 1. It was Sonic 3.
It was a Sonic, and I don't know if that's true or if this is urban legend. Is it? Okay, all right.
It is true.
But that music is so great. I believe it, right? I mean, it's like, well, if it wasn't him who did the music for that series or had a part in it, it's totally believable, because that music is better than anything I maybe in video game music history, right? And I'm not going to sit down and listen to it, but it's it's an earworm that I'm going to have some trouble getting out of my head tonight. And I think it's really funny, because you compare the musical capabilities and the sound processing capabilities of the Genesis and the SNES. They're not even comparable. The Super Nintendo had the MIDI symphony chips, and everything sounded huge and glorious. And I'm thinking about the soundtrack from Castlevania just sounds like it was composed by like a modern actual composer who was doing a symphony, right? Whereas, the chip tunes from the Sega were a little bit more, well, what you would get from your average arcade game. But Sonic had the most iconic music. So I think if you look at launch titles, I still think Super Nintendo wins and will always win, because you can't have anything. I don't know if you can have anything better than Mario World. But a very close second is Sonic the Hedgehog. Altered Beast is, it's back there with, I mean, it's kind of like having Hang On, as being the pack-in title from the Master System. I mean, it's just about as big of a joke as that, right? And you think that they would have learned putting Hang On against, Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers. I'm getting my brothers and Marios confused, prefixes and suffixes. You think they would have learned that from the first time they got beaten in the States? For some reason they didn't, but it's an interesting comparison in how important a launch title is, because if they would have never brought Sonic out, there would not have been a reintroduction of the Genesis to the American public. And we wouldn't even be talking about this. We would be making the Genesis joke with the TurboGrafx joke, even though, I mean, we are talking about the true 16-bit systems and not the fake 16-bit, the 8-bit imposter that was the TurboGrafx 16. But we wouldn't even be talking about it if it hadn't been for Sonic. So, I mean, I think they get points for realizing their mistake, resetting. But, when they made that mistake before and got beat in 85 and 86, in North America, you'd think they would have figured it out. But that's where I start with the launch titles.
That's a good place to start. And to borrow some information from the book that you let off with, Anthony, packing Sonic the Hedgehog in with Genesis was Sega of America's idea, and Sega of Japan was opposed to it.
Yep.
Like, they did not want to do it at all.
I remember that.
Yeah. And so it was really Sega of America that drove Genesis adoption in the US by recognizing that we've got a competitor in Sonic the Hedgehog. And for my 2 cents, I agree. Altered Beast is off the table. I'm not even considering that the pack-in combination that we're talking about here. But interestingly enough, at the time when I was a kid with the Genesis, and even through the Genesis and SNES life cycle, I would have said Sonic the Hedgehog was the better game. Now, as a middle-aged guy, I say hands down it's Mario World. And so I've kind of switched on that. And I think that's the adventuresome of youth that is Sonic versus the fine wine that is Super Mario World. But I think that there is also no competition, but I wanted to point out that at one point in my life there was stiff competition.
Sonic has no depth. I think that's my problem with it.
I disagree.
Oh no!
Listen,
no,
boy,
no.
that's
no,
a religious argument, right? I think that if you're going to sit down and play 10 minutes of a game, Sonic is the one I'm going to play 10 minutes of. If you're going to say you have one game for the next 2 months, I mean, it's not even a competition because I Sonic wears out fast.
Oh, if you think Sonic doesn't have any depth, you're playing it wrong. You're just rushing through the level as fast as you can.
Yes.
Granted. Well, hello. Well, I want to know what Link thinks.
Link, well, let's see. Link, what do you think? He just wants to be pet. So
I think he said Sonic has no depth. And I speak cat. I have 4 cats.
All I heard was purr. So
okay.
Yeah. So
that's
well, I think just to step in, I completely disagree with you about Sonic not having depth. Sonic the Hedgehog has a ton of depth in those levels, with the bonus rounds, with the different hidden areas and stuff like that. I think there's a lot more to it than either you remember or realize. But my experience with the two games has actually switched the way that Chris has had, but in the opposite direction, and I'll tell you why. When I first had both of these games, I will also argue, actually, just to go back, that Altered Beast wasn't the worst idea as a pack-in game at the time. And the reason why I say that is because when it was a pack-in game, it was in 1989. There were still only 8-bit systems out there. So that having Sega come out with not only a 16-bit system, but showing off that, hey, our 16-bit system can play arcade games. So instead of you pumping quarters into these machines, you can have the game for yourself at home. So I actually thought it was a smart idea on their part, especially because they did not have a mascot yet. Alex Kidd did not hit the mark that they wanted it to. Yeah. They didn't have the new mascot for the Sega Genesis, so they went with the next best thing, something established and already successful. So I actually thought it was not a bad idea. However, obviously when Super Nintendo came out with Super Mario World, they clearly needed something to compete with that. And at that time, I believe
it had
Sonic
Rise from Your Grave.
Yes. Well, you have to rise from your grave, okay? Sometimes you just have to. But with Sonic, Sonic was obviously the right idea. Sega of America was absolutely right to put that in as a packing game. I will say, playing the two as a kid, Super Mario World was far superior in my mind playing them then. When I look back on them now, as iconic as Super Mario World is, I give the edge to Sonic for a couple of reasons. One is that it was something new. It was really exciting. It was really fast. It was colorful. The character had an attitude, which at the time, when you thought about it, especially like for our age bracket, as we were shifting into those teen years, he was the perfect character to kind of lead you into that with that attitude. It's like, okay, I go, this guy's got something. This guy's got something to him. He's got an edge to him, which is kind of cool. So I think timing wise, at least for us, I thought it was very smart and well done. And then the other thing about it is Sonic, to me, is responsible for Sega's existence. Without Sonic, I don't think you have Sega or Sega's longevity, even to today. I don't think they necessarily would exist today if they did not have Sonic. And Sonic has become one of the most iconic video game characters in the world. And in fact, I think at one point, if not now, previously, his recognition level surpassed Mario for a period of time, where more people in the world knew who Sonic was more than Mario. So I think those reasons let me look back and realize, you know what? I think Sonic had the edge because of everything it did for Sega. Mario was already a proven entity, so it was just building on what was already there. Sonic created and saved a company.
Right. It's
strong argument.
Life cut short. I think we could all agree Sega should have had another shot.
Yeah.
But you're right. He rose them from their graves.
From the grave. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
if I'm not making a weird joke, if someone doesn't know what that means, go watch a video of Altered Beast.
Well, you are making a weird joke, but it can be both things at the same time.
Yes. But no, the whole open, yeah, you're right. The whole open of Altered Beast on the Sega Genesis, it does sound a little. It sounds a little muddled.
It's odd, but
yeah,
that's the only thing that isn't. I think like perfect to the arcade. If that's the only thing, because speech did take a ton of megabits, or megas as they were called on the cover of the cartridges, and I love how they would say that it's a 4 mega cartridge. Like that's supposed to mean something to your average consumer. It's just the number, right? I guess the difference between 8, 16, and 32-bit and whatnot. We were really into numbers at the time and bits.
yes.
But the speech did take. So I mean, I guess it saved probably a few Ks just to go with Gwave. I would have taken a second take and tried to get a hard R in there, but
no, I think you know what we look back on it now. Right, as a good memory, as opposed to like if it was just normal grave, we wouldn't be talking about it as much.
We would not be talking about Altered Beast. We would have given it a nod and moved on. But
yeah, and just another quick hit, just to close this off, just in terms of packing games. Super Nintendo did have other packing games outside of Super Mario World because there was a Super Mario All Stars pack in at one point.
Yes,
I think might have been. Was there a Donkey Kong Country one towards the end? I think there was.
Yes. Was there a Link to the Past one as well towards the end? Or was that
I think there might have been a Link to the Past one, but not towards the end, somewhere in the middle.
Was the Donkey Kong Country one, did it go head to head with the Vector Man pack-in of the Sega Genesis 3? No,
it might have. It might have. Yeah.
I want to say that it was after PlayStation launch, actually. It was when, they were doing the other model. What do they call the redesign of the Super Nintendo?
Yes.
What do they call that?
Oh, yeah, I forgot what they call that one.
Yeah,
but I know what you're saying.
I think it was when they were doing that, and they were just like, let's move as many units as we can because we know the N64 is, right around the corner.
Right around the corner. Yeah, and Country came out towards more towards the mid '90s. So
yeah.
But all right, that was a good start with the packing games. I think that was an excellent way to go. Chris, I'm going to toss it over to you to throw us in another direction.
I'm going to throw us in completely other direction and do my game comparison because there really isn't a game comparison here. But Link to the Past on Super Nintendo versus what on Genesis?
Landstalker?
Yeah. I think that's like the one that you could be like kind of, sort of. I mean, you could pull out, Monster Boy and Monster World or whatever it was called. Wonder Boy. That's what it is. Wonder Boy and Monster World, which is a great game, but it is no Legend of Zelda Link to the Past. No. I mean, come on. And I wanted to bring this one up for me personally because this has a lot to do with my own story, which is I had the Genesis. I was struggling to find games to play, but after Sonic and after they started kind of getting their feet under them, I mean, there were tons of great games on Genesis, don't get me wrong, but it was Link to the Past, playing that at a friend of mine's house, that I was like, oh, what have I done? And at that point I was like, I've got to mow lawns, I've got to save money, I've got to do whatever I can to get a Super Nintendo so that I can get a copy of Link to the Past. And there was nothing on Genesis. Like, as I'm trying to save this money and as I'm trying to get that SNES, I'm like, okay, what can I play that even gives me that flavor on Genesis? And it doesn't exist. There's just nothing on that system. And I think that was a huge oversight because even the TurboGrafx had a Zelda clone. Which was Utopia, and even NEC was smart enough to be like, oh, we need a game like this, and Sega never found their version of Zelda.
They did have on one of the Master System, which was the Golden Axe Warriors, which was not a bad game. No, it's not that bad of a game, right?
I'm not saying it's a bad game, but it doesn't hold up, and it was locked to the Master System. If they'd done something like that with the Golden Axe IP on Genesis that was a Zelda clone, I would have been there. I would have played that.
I'm just saying that there was a path for them,
which they did not take.
They chose not to take it, right? Which is just weird because they were smart enough to course correct with Sonic, but they stuck to boy, I'm going to say it again. I think they stuck to games with less depth because Link, the Legend of Zelda games have incredible depth. I'm talking to the biggest Zelda fan ever, right? You have to agree with me. There's a lot of depth there, and I don't know where the Genesis. I don't know if they even felt like they could compete in that market.
Yeah.
So they became known for sports games, which I mean, maybe it's just a bias. I don't think that there's a lot there. And I like some sports games, but to me, it's just not. And I'm sure a real Madden fan could school me, and I would be embarrassed at my lack of knowledge. But I just don't feel like it's very much fun. Also, when I'm looking at my controller, trying to figure out what X and O do every time I play a football game or whatever. That's a bad example for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, but I mean, those games have. I can't develop muscle memory for some of those more complex sports games. So maybe I'm just not giving them their due. Maybe they have more depth than I'm capable of.
Well, I think when you just to rewind a little bit because you went from Zelda to sports.
Well, because it's they focused on something
right what they focused on. When you were saying the biggest Zelda fan, were you talking about Chris or me?
That's right, you. I think you're the biggest Zelda fan. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I am I am a huge Zelda fan. And I agree 100% with both of you. Yeah, there was, and as much as I tried researching what would have been an equivalent on the Genesis for Link to the Past, came up with absolutely nothing. There was nothing even close. And I do agree. Complete missed opportunity on Sega's part because creating some games with that depth, I think, would have also helped continue the longevity of the Genesis. But the Genesis in and of itself was successful with what they were doing. So I guess in their mind, maybe they just didn't feel like they needed it. They were, I mean, just to do, again, this is just my thought. I mean, they churned out 4 different Sonic titles on that system, whereas like Mario got, I mean, when you think platformer wise, Mario got 2, right? And the second one, I would argue, was a Yoshi game, not a Mario game. So I would say like you had Super Mario World, absolutely amazing. I go, but in terms of platformers, that's where it stayed. Whereas you got 4 really good Sonic games, or you got 3 really good ones, and then the add-on when they added Knuckles to it, which was still really cool. But Zelda, yeah, head and shoulders, amazing game. Link to the Past, arguably one of the best Zelda games, and no comparison whatsoever on Sega. So there's like really no competition there. It's like Super Nintendo wins hands down when you think about that. There's no, I can't even think of a character to compare Link to on the Sega Genesis.
Nope.
So you didn't even try. And I totally understand it. Creating an original character, an original IP, that's hard.
Oh, yes.
I think that's probably harder than creating a good copy of a game when you already have the pattern established. Because you could tell a copy character. A copy game could still have a lot of fun, whereas a copy character is going to be more like a joke. They didn't even try.
No, and I think to your point though, I think that what they were focusing on, and I think what they were aiming at is I think they were aiming for the older audience. They were going for they wanted to be edgier. They wanted to capitalize on the kids from the 8-bit era who were becoming teenagers. And teenagers, and maybe in their minds, or at least in my head, I would think like, you don't want to make these cutesy little characters that are just running around doing these things. You want edgy, you want fights, you want sports, you want those types of things. And I think what I'll do is I'll use this to lead into a comparison which you started, which are sports games, just a general overall sports games. Sega went really hard into the sports genre, and you only have to look at the celebrity games that they had to show you how hard they went into it, because most of the football games that came out had a celebrity attached to it. Even if you step back from the sports games, like, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker on the Sega Genesis, like they went after the celebrity thing because celebrities are cool. Sports stars are cool. My brain's not I think
Reggie Jackson, the beautiful Tommy Lasorda.
Yep.
Reggie Jackson was a Master System, right?
Yeah.
But Tommy Lasorda,
I think his
visage, beautiful man. I mean, just gorgeous. He was the Brad Pitt of baseball in '89, and which is why they went with him.
I was trying to think. Was it John? Did they use John Elway in a?
No, it was Joe Montana.
Joe Montana. Yes. Okay.
Joe Montana. Joe Montana is an actor.
Joe Montana is an actor. Joe Montana.
He does mob movies, but
yes,
I would have played that.
No, but Joe Montana's football, like they Evander Holyfield's boxing, like they went
Douglas boxing.
Lester Douglas boxing, like they went after the sports stars because they felt that connecting a sports star to a game is just more appealing. And I honestly think that if coming down to sports games, I think from that respect, they definitely had the edge. NHL 94, which is still considered to this day the best hockey game ever made. They still have like tournaments that go around the country. I don't know about around the world, but they still go around the US. NHL 94 tournaments on the Sega Genesis, even though it came out on the Super Nintendo. It's the Sega Genesis one everybody remembers.
ROM hacks with rosters and it is, which is amazing.
Yeah. So, and again, I mean, did Super Nintendo have sports games? Yes, they did. I was like, but I'll be honest with you, I remember playing very few sports games on the Super Nintendo. If I wanted a hockey game, if I wanted a football game, if I wanted a baseball game, I went straight to the Genesis. And the only comparable one I can think of for Nintendo would have been like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, which they didn't have the rights to by the time they got to Super Nintendo, and then they came out with Super Punch-Out, which was a great game. I loved Super Punch-Out. I'm like, but it just was missing that little extra with that celebrity endorsement.
Yeah, I think that the Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, the original one where he fought only women, that was probably not a good move for Nintendo. This is where I want to make my Magic Johnson transmitting AIDS joke, but I'm just going to leave that one on the table. You're welcome to edit that out or leave it in.
Anyway, I don't know how to respond to that.
It's just
so I think we'll just move on.
I have other AIDS material that I'll just hold for the next time you have us.
Wow!
I called in with AIDS recently, and they said I said it was 24 hour. I'm sorry, Anthony.
Wow, it's
a joke. My family has had a virus going around, but it's just a zombie one. So I've kept them in a room.
We'll stick to the zombie one. Chris, please to you.
Yeah. Let me
take it out.
I will speak to the Sega Genesis sports situation because you can probably tell I'm not a sports guy, as I proved that I don't even know my football stars that appeared in Genesis video games. However, even being that kind of a person growing up, I loved Madden football. And I thought that was crazy fun. And I played, from the launch to probably 96-ish or so. I think was still on Genesis by that point. And that's when I fell off of it. So when it transitioned to PlayStation, I was like, the Genesis ones were fantastic. And they chased that market and they captured it extraordinarily well. So kudos to them for it.
Dave, what about you?
So I will say that I mostly played sports games on the NES because I played baseball games, and you had the RBI baseball series and the bases loaded series, which I don't still even modern games. I don't think you beat those from a baseball perspective. Also, baseball is just like it's infinitely it's simple to understand. It's infinitely strategic and complex. But I think it does lend itself to button mashing and quick plays, whereas the depth of these sports games, I think I maybe have recognized that I'm just not smart enough for them during the course of this podcast.
All right, well, we'll hold you to that.
I will hold myself to that.
All right, that's fair. And since we'll go back, we're gonna go back to you now. What are you gonna compare next?
Well, could we compare the hardware a little bit? And
we can, but I kind of want to close on that.
Okay, all right. There's some interesting things with the hardware, and I'm not talking about specs. I'm just talking about the aggressiveness of how the hardware was used. So I think that I think that the Street Fighter Mortal Kombat debate rages on. It does get into a little bit of the hardware because you have to talk about the controller.
True.
For this one, but let's just say that with the 6-button controller, Street Fighter, and I'm not a big Mortal Kombat person, but at this stage, everybody wanted to play it. It definitely leaned more to Street Fighter, but the Genesis had the Super Nintendo beat, and I think it all comes down to just the speed at which they were able to, because speed of gameplay is critically important with those early with all 2D fighters. But I will give it to Genesis also. They had Pit Fighter, which was which was Mortal Kombat before Mortal Kombat. And it did look just like the arcade, which is not a compliment.
Nope. No, not at all. That's one of those games where whenever I see the like the cover of it or like the ad for it, I just cringe because there were very few games that I really would want to like just throw in a fire, and that's one of them.
Oh, it's bad.
Oh, it's so bad.
The 3 characters you get to choose from.
Mm-hmm. Terrible.
Yeah, I completely agree that it comes down to the controller for me. I think the ports of Street Fighter 2 are just fine. I think the ports of Mortal Kombat on both systems are just fine. Although obviously Genesis has the blood code for the first one, and then for 2 and 3 it was just, you could do whatever you wanted to on the systems. But barring that, like I can get past that if everything had been better on the SNES, but that 6-button Genesis controller absolutely just is the way you have to play Street Fighter 2 in a 16-bit world, right? And even though SNES had Street Fighter 2 as a exclusive for a window, I don't remember how long the window was, but it was a while before ultimately it came to Genesis. And when it came to Genesis, it was actually the Champions Edition, not the original one.
Yep.
But even still, the Genesis plus the 6-button made for a better experience. Now, if you're going to stick me with a 3-button Genesis controller, it's the complete opposite.
Yep.
Because that was a nightmare. You had to hit start to shift the row of 3 keys to be punches or to be kicks for Street Fighter, and that's no way to play. I mean, this is a civilized world. Come on, what was that?
That was it. That was their answer when they only had 3 buttons.
Which was not a solid answer. I mean, so thankfully they did the 6-button controller, and that truly made those games superior on the Genesis platform, in my opinion.
TurboGrafx would like to enter the chat and remind you that it only had 2 buttons.
Yes.
It had a 6-button controller that it released for Street Fighter too.
Yes. So... And no one bought. There's a warehouse.
It was dead by then.
But yes.
But no, I do agree. I agree with both of you guys. I mean, the whole point of the 6-button controller was for Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, and it was absolutely essential. Sega knew this and had to come out with it quickly if they wanted any hopes of competing with Nintendo on these 2 games. I will say, I agree with you both. Like the Genesis versions were far superior, and the other thing that I thought was smart on Sega's part, especially when Street Fighter 2 finally came around, because they came out with it second. Not only did they come out with the 6-button controller for it, but the Sega version of Street Fighter 2 had a little bit more going for it than the Super Nintendo version, which made made kids and adults want to buy that version, even if they had the Super Nintendo one. They included the intro in their Street Fighter version, and then they included an extra battle mode in there as well to entice people to buy it. So I thought I didn't
know that was a difference.
Yeah, that was the difference between the 2 Street Fighter 2s. And then for Mortal Kombat, obviously you brought it up. That I thought the biggest mistake on Nintendo's part was not putting the blood in the first version. I mean, you can't play Mortal Kombat without blood. It makes no sense whatsoever. So just the fact that Sega was like, nope, blood's in there, was enough to just make everybody run over there. And then on top of it, I thought the one on the Genesis, I thought the music was better. I remember liking the music better on the Genesis version. It had the intro and the bios that the Super Nintendo did not have. The Super Nintendo had the bios, but it was a little bit limited in what they did. It felt like they just wanted to put the game out just to put it out because it was so popular. And if I remember correctly too, the fatalities on the Super Nintendo version were actually like tampered down a bit.
Yeah.
They kind of minimized the level of violence that they had. So, and that was absolutely the worst thing you can do with a game like this. It's like there's a reason why everybody loved Mortal Kombat. It was for the violence. So to take the violence and kind of tame it made no sense.
But didn't they have to because of the whole? I mean, and they didn't they put themselves into a box with the Senate hearings. And not to get into that, that's a whole
that
topic.
Came later. That actually came.
But
later.
that came later. But I mean, the Nintendo of America president said, I believe his exact words were about Night Trap, which was the Sega game that will never appear on a Sega system. But it wasn't or excuse me, on a Nintendo system.
Yep.
But wasn't the whole impetus for that discussion? It wasn't Night Trap. It was Mortal Kombat and the violence in games. I mean, didn't they cast their lot with that by not putting the blood in there, by saying this is who we are? You won't get this in our system until the sequel. Then you'll get it. But that wasn't like an accident. That was a purposeful decision where they said we are not going to have this in our console. And they had that line. They held that line for what, a year and a half or 2 years, and then the rating system allowed that to open up, and then they could say, well, now that they're rated, people don't know, which I guess is fine. I don't know.
And Nintendo did specifically use Mortal Kombat as a talking point during that whole situation. So they, regardless of what the initial motivation was, they certainly tried to take the moral high ground by saying, oh, look at our version of Mortal Kombat. It doesn't have the blood. It doesn't have the fatalities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a little bit of an embarrassing piece of Nintendo history, because after the rating systems, then they were just like, who cares,
Yeah.
And so it in hindsight, they didn't have quite the moral high ground that they professed to have.
And also, I thought it was the Senate aide handed, when he said we will never have Night Trap on our system, and they handed them the Night Trap beta. No, sir, it's complete. No,
they said they would never have it on their system, but
it's on Switch.
It's on the Switch. It is on the Switch. So there you go. That did not age well, did it?
No.
But it was a terrible game that no one plays for the gameplay. They play it for the kitsch factor, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It was never as bad as it was professed to be in the Senate. It's just they didn't know what they were talking about.
Other atrocities were being committed in the Senate at that time, I believe. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think things going on in Congress were more risque than what was happening in Night Trap. So
I do think Robert Byrd ripping the head off fellow senators and having the whole spinal column come out, that was pretty intense. That was his fatality move.
Yeah, it was for C-SPAN's ratings, though.
It was. It was C-SPAN 2 specifically, but yes.
Well, without that, we wouldn't have C-SPAN 2, so that's how it survived. All right, Chris, I'm swinging around to you.
All right. So the next one that I will call out is similar to my Link to the Past, but I'm going to call out Final Fantasy versus Shining Force. And I think that that's a good comparison to make. Both are the big RPG games of the system. Anthony, I think you and I may diverge a little bit here because I am not into Shining Force. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So to me, this is a clear SNES win with Final Fantasy, especially Final Fantasy 3/6, however you want to title it.
Yep.
I think is one of the landmark RPGs of the genre. So I don't think Genesis has anything to hold a candle to this. And if you want, just to liven up the conversation, we can throw Phantasy Star in there as well, which I am a fan of the Phantasy Star games, but they are still not Final Fantasy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give it to you on the Final Fantasy part, just because Final Fantasy is in my head, it's like the de facto RPG franchise. Like you don't think of RPGs without bringing up Final Fantasy almost immediately, right? Although I will argue, and again, that this is still a Super Nintendo argument, I would probably argue that Chrono Trigger to me trumps Final Fantasy. By itself.
Okay, if we're gonna bring Chrono into it, I wanted to give Shining Force a little bit of a fighting chance.
No, I will even say, as much as I love Shining Force, like I don't think Shining Force compares to Chrono Trigger. No. I don't. Chrono Trigger to me, I think, is probably the best RPG ever made. But when we're talking about Final Fantasy and Shining Force, the only reason why I really lean towards Shining Force, there are two reasons. One, I never played Final Fantasy on Super Nintendo at the time. It did not register. I didn't become a huge RPG fan until Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation. That's the one that really made me dive in. And I never went backwards. But Shining Force was the first real RPG I played through. And even still, when I think about Final Fantasy, and I've seen, obviously I've played a little bit of them and I've seen gameplay. The tactics battle system to me was so much fun. It just didn't like that was the tipping point for me. It's like that's why Shining Force to me, if I had to compare it to something, I would obviously compare it to Final Fantasy Tactics. But the story in Shining Force to me, I loved the story. I loved all of the characters. I felt like they really did a great job with it. And the only reason why I would give it an edge on that system is for the battle system. That's where it wins for me. But I do think Final Fantasy as a franchise is by far superior. Dave is just staring off into the distance because he's never played any of them.
No, I have played them. I just I think that I not being an RPG person, I'm gonna judge it off of the longevity of the series, and I think that longevity. Yeah,
longevity, like Wave,
like yes,
Wave longevity. We got it.
Yeah, but yeah. I don't. Final Fantasy continues to go, but I think that's also part of the Final Fantasy formula is they can cast whatever that they want, right? There's no there. The formula is you can do whatever you want in the Final Fantasy world, whereas it feels like the other RPGs had plot and character rules that they needed to follow. But Final Fantasy's still around. They're still making games. They're revisiting those old series, whereas. To my knowledge, Phantasy Star and Shining Force, I mean, we've not dipped back into those wells in a long time, unless I'm wrong.
Yeah, the last Shining Force style game was in 2018. So it's actually been around longer than you thought.
I did not realize it.
Well, it's called, it kind of shifted away from Shining Force. It's called the Shining series. So there are a whole bunch of games that start with the word Shining. It's not just Shining
I thought that was about the Overlook Hotel and Here's Johnny.
That's basically what they did. Like they went into they went into all these different alternative universes, what Jack Torrance did if he made different choices.
That is an incredible game.
Yep.
And I hope that many of them are more interesting than the Shining movie, which is Kubrick's worst film. But I would just say, the longevity of the series is that would be how I would judge it. But I mean, to me, I love the Dragon Warrior series, which peaked in the 8-bit system. So I didn't have to play much beyond that. I just really enjoyed those games. And I looked at what they were doing in the 16-bit systems, and graphics didn't seem that important. The expanse of the world was important. And Dragon Warrior 4 was a huge world. Way bigger than anything that existed in 8-bit before that or after, before that. And I think it was as big as what you got in Final Fantasy or the 16-bit platform games. So I'm not a great judge of this one.
Okay, that's fair. And I think it's safe to say that between the two, I would still give Final Fantasy the edge as much as I personally loved Shining Force more. So,
but I have lots of notes about Aladdin.
Well, I was about to jump to that. So let's switch gears. Let's go over because everybody talks about these. Two very popular Disney games on both systems, Aladdin and Lion King, and everybody always talks about which system had it better. In my experience, because this was Disney's sweet spot for me in the 90s, Aladdin, Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, like they just were hitting them out of the park. I'd even put Hercules in there. Although I think right after Hercules, maybe they started to go downhill. But Aladdin and Lion King, two great games on both systems. I honestly don't think you could go wrong, whichever one you wound up getting. I still think you had a great experience with them. Lion King was ridiculously hard, no matter which console you had it on. Aladdin to me was less challenging, but still challenging. Aladdin, though, I would give the edge to Sega specifically because you actually had a sword, which was very important. I mean, I get Super Nintendo not wanting a Disney character to run around slashing people with a sword, but just running around throwing apples isn't really that fun, or jumping on somebody's head. It kind of loses a bit of it just loses a bit of the gameplay fun to me on the Super Nintendo.
And he had a sword in the movie, right? So
yes,
it wasn't like the movie they were all carrying walkie-talkies.
No, that was a totally different series. But I'm sure if Disney were to George Lucas Aladdin, they would run back and take the sword out of his hand. So but again, I thought the Super Nintendo version was more vibrant color-wise, but the way the characters move, the animation in the Sega version to me was more fluid and more fun. So, and then on Super Nintendo, you had Apu running around with you, which was a nice plus too. So like they to me, Aladdin, each one had their own little intricacies that worked well that I don't think you could have gone wrong either way. Lion King to me, Super Nintendo had the edge overall. I thought especially with Lion King, I thought the colors were incredibly important, and they nailed it on Super Nintendo. I thought Sega was a little bit less than. The music on the Super Nintendo I can still hear in my head. It was definitely better in my opinion, and just the graphics overall. So Lion King, I felt there's more distinct differences between the two, even though the gameplay I think is similar. And the difficulty is similar. Those are both ridiculously hard. I remember when I beat the Super Nintendo version of Lion King, it took me forever, and I was so happy when I beat it. But yeah, that one I give Lion King the edge. Dave,
did they famously have the Disney animators working on both of these games, which just made them just beautiful and fluid? Isn't that part of the lore?
That I don't know.
I don't know either.
That I do not know.
I have heard that. I've read that. You could fact check some or don't. I think I've said other things that are very wrong mispronunciations. I mean, I definitely you can't go wrong with any of them. I'm giving the edge to the Aladdin for the Genesis just because of the sword, right? I think it just added more to the gameplay. But they both looked, all four of them looked like $1 million and were some of the best looking games on any of the systems. I mean, I think you have to go to like Donkey Kong Country to find something that looks better than those games.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I'm very impressed, Anthony, that you beat Lion King on Super Nintendo. You need a t-shirt that says that.
It took work. That stampede was no joke.
Yeah.
All right. Dave, we're going to throw it to you.
Are we ready for the hardware talk?
I think we're ready for the hardware talk.
All right. So this is where, I mean, you can do the spec representation, which I think that's boring. So and I think we've already hit on the controller, right? Which, I mean, the launch controllers, I think Super Nintendo wins. It's just a more comfortable controller. Yep. It was, 3 times as many control buttons. The 6-button Genesis controller, though, is, I mean, just they're still making clones of it for modern systems to this day, not as a retro experience, but because it's the best way to play fighting games. I mean, or you could argue that in the Saturn controller, but I mean, to me, the Saturn controller is just an evolution of the 6-button Genesis controller. So, but I think that the Genesis had the hardware expansion, right? So everybody remembers their NES. They flipped it over, they pulled out the piece of plastic, and they had this card, and you could only imagine what they intended you to do with that card. Genesis actually did it. Genesis had the power-based converter, or that allowed you to play Master System games. It had obviously the Sega CD. It had 32X. It had the Sega Channel, which was the cartridge that allowed, excuse me, before online gaming, you had the ability to download and play games on a subscription level. They did all sorts of crazy stuff. What did Super Nintendo do? The Super Game Boy I'm struggling to think of anything else that they did. They
They
didn't
had a
feel like they
mouse.
needed to. They had a mouse
And a
for
mouse,
Mario
Mario
Paint,
Paint.
but that's a controller, right? And to me, it kind of speaks to Nintendo always resting on their core characters, their core first party, and not being aggressive or inventive enough. Like once they release a system, they do amazing things when they release a system, but then they don't do anything for a while. And um, outside of just sort of evolutions of their own characters in their first party software. And I think this is where Genesis gets a ton of credit in that they really tried to push what they were doing inside of that generation, which I think the 32X was still inside of this generation. It doesn't count, right? It doesn't go to the 32-bit generation. They get a lot of credit for the aggressiveness of trying that, and I think that was the dream, that the promise of flipping over NES and seeing that expansion port that never got used. The Genesis actually realized that in a way that maybe no other system is. I'm struggling even with modern systems to think about ways that the hardware was just the base hardware. They kept iterating on it and doing something clever with it, so you didn't have to buy a whole new system. Although Sega CD pretty darn expensive, you didn't have to buy that whole new system, and you could get a new experience from it.
I would actually put that feather in Nintendo's cap because I find it very frustrating to have to buy add-ons. Like even to this day when it's like PSVR, why are you making me buy something else? Come on. I don't know, there's just something about my brain and the way it works that I do not like that actually. And if the Sega CD had been massively successful, or if the 32X had been, just the games on it were just unparalleled, maybe this would be a different story. But to me, both of those systems are a little disappointing, especially at the time, because I wanted a Sega CD because I was like, oh, CDs, that's the future, right? And I had a friend who had one, and I played Sewer Shark, and I was like, if this is the future,
Yeah.
I don't want any part of this. And as an adult, and as somebody who is invested in retro video games, I've grown to a huge appreciation of the Sega CD. And there's some stellar games on that platform. But overall, I don't know that it did Sega any favors, and I think it garnered actually a lot of bad taste in some people's mouths. And even looking at it historically, I think there's a lot of people that are like, oh, that the Tower of Power was a waste. And there's not a lot that has really survived from those two expansions that has moved the needle, so to speak. So I think Nintendo, by I guess you could kind of look at it as designing right out of the gates. I'm going to give that one to Nintendo's camp.
But they came out 3 years later.
Yeah.
So you could say designing right, but Genesis designed first.
Okay.
They did design first, but I will say this about Sega. I give them a lot of credit for taking those risks the way that Dave says, right? I think the Sega CD was a good idea at the time when the rush to CD was a thing. Like, and correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say TurboGrafx made it there first with
Yes, they did.
TurboGrafx made it there first. And let's also remember that Nintendo was working with Sony on a CD add-on. That was what was going to be in that expansion port with the Super Nintendo. You were going to get the Super Nintendo PlayStation. So they were working on something. So it made sense to me that Sega was also trying to get into the market with something CD based because Nintendo was doing the same thing. Obviously, Nintendo balked at the last minute there and wound up going with CDI. Let's not forget they went with CDI and we saw what happened there.
But it was not an add-on.
No, it was not. It was not an add-on. That is true. It was not an add-on. I personally had the Sega CD and I really enjoyed it. Yes, like games like Sewer Shark and like Power Rangers, which were essentially just press a button at the. They were all like Space Ace, where you just press a button at the right time. Not the best of games, but they did have some really good games. Like Star Wars Rebel Assault was a good game on there. So I think Sylphid was Sylphid on there. I think Sylphid was on there. So there were some games on there that were really solid. The 32X was a complete waste. Absolutely waste. But I understood they felt this push to go to market with these things. They were just trying to stay ahead. Now, had they had focused on the Genesis itself and the quality of games itself, I think probably would have been the better move for them. So at the end of the day, like hardware, and another way to look at it too, and again, not to go to numbers, the Sega Genesis came out in 1989, 2 years before the Super Nintendo. Overall, sold 29 million units. The Super Nintendo, which came out 2 years later, sold 49 million units. I mean, that really says a lot for just how powerful and how just amazing the Super Nintendo was during this time. That now, granted, Nintendo with their NES really staked their claim, so people trusted Nintendo more, which is why it sold more. And also, those numbers include Japan. Sega did not sell well in Japan. The Genesis did not sell well in Japan. One funny note about these two, and I just want to throw it in here, it's not related to the competition between the two, but it was just an article I read recently, is that in Brazil, the Sega Genesis is still sold as a console, which is amazing. I know it's, I mean, it's 30 plus years later, 35 years later, and you can still pick up a Genesis there, which is amazing. But between the two, like if I'm picking hardware wise, the Super FX chip definitely blows the blast processing out of the water. So
you had your Mode 7s.
Yeah.
They never talked about Mode 8.
No, they never
I don't
did.
think they finished it.
Nah, probably not. But for the time, I thought at the end of the day, two great systems, really solid games on both. They each had their premier titles. Nintendo probably had more, but Sega really did have a good solid library, and they created an icon in Sonic, which you can see right now has $1 billion movie franchise.
Yes.
I love those movies.
I think Mario will too here shortly, but
the first Mario movie already made $1 billion. Well, the animated one.
But
let's not talk about
yet.
We won't talk about the '90s one.
No.
So this is actually a really good example of Sega at the time versus Nintendo. 3 movies in the space of what Nintendo has done in 1 movie.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier to market, more in a period of time. You could say that the Mario movie is better than the 3 Sonic movies, which I don't think I don't actually agree with that because I love those Sonic movies. But I mean, there is a quantity versus quality, earlier to market, the ability to put stuff out and the aggressiveness with the IP, which they've shown with Sonic, aggressiveness with the technology, which they had at the time. I think it's just 2 very different mindsets, whereas Nintendo is a very safe and comfortable brand that does not take risks.
Correct.
Unless they have like Wii U somewhere in the title, and then they fire everyone who was involved with it, so they never take another risk again.
What are you talking about? The Wii U just became the Switch.
All right, fair enough.
Right. You should have gone for the Virtual Boy instead of the.
You should have gone for the Virtual Boy.
That's true.
Always go for the Virtual Boy. You want to talk about bad risk? Go for the Virtual Boy. Yeah, that's the no-brainer.
But it is a risk-averse company.
Mm-hmm.
Which has worked for them because they're still making consoles where Sega's not.
Well, Nintendo always says that they are not interested in competing with Sony or Sega or Microsoft. They've always said it's like we know what we are, we know who we are, we know what we want to make, and they just do it. They don't look outside of that, and it works for them.
So here's a statement. I'm curious if you agree with it. I think Nintendo learned that lesson right now in the SNES versus Genesis console war. I think that is where they formed that, like they put those pieces together and they're like, oh, this is who we are. Mm-hmm. So if they never had this competition, Nintendo as we know them now may not have existed.
Oh, I never thought about that. What a great point that the war defined them.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about that too, if they did not go that direction during this time, we wouldn't have had a Sony PlayStation, because if they had chosen to go the risk route, they would have stayed with Sony and we would have had a Super Nintendo PlayStation and not a Sony PlayStation.
Crazy. Nature abhors a vacuum. Somebody else would have stepped into that I think that 3-way battle.
Maybe
it could have been Microsoft. Maybe it could have been that Sega lasted longer, and then it would have been Nintendo, Microsoft.
Well, the Saturn might have held on.
Yeah.
The Saturn might have held on. The Dreamcast might have held on, because to me, the Dreamcast was probably one of the most underrated, powerful systems out there. It was a shame that it died so quickly. But yeah,
when we explore that generation, I really want to get into that, because I think that it's probably the most overrated system that we have just created an emotional attachment to.
Wow.
Because it did not get a chance to flourish, right? It's the child who died at 2, and you think about what he could have done at 20. Man, I'm bringing this podcast down.
Wow. And on that note,
do we get to vote?
I was gonna say, here is this final decision.
Straight up draw. Straight up cultural draw.
That's your official vote?
Straight up draw. Nintendo wins. It's a draw.
Straight up draw.
Won.
Nintendo wins. Wait a minute.
Nintendo lasted. They still make consoles.
So a showdown in the video game corral. They both shoot each other, but Nintendo's standing.
Yes. Because Nintendo was risk averse, and they wore the bulletproof vest, so they were able to survive the shots. I just came up with that. I truly think that it was as close to a 59 or 49-51. I was going to add.
Wow.
I was going to add numbers to 100. I think it's really close. I think Nintendo edges it out.
Okay.
But without a good competitor, you don't get a champion that's worth much. So Sega really brought it to the colossal gaming juggernaut, and it was then, and it is now. Slight like the razor thin margin, Nintendo wins.
All right, Chris.
I think that what Sega did in even competing against Nintendo was amazing. And I'm going to reference that Console Wars book one more time. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you read it, because it is astonishing how well Sega played that game. And so kudos to them. However, as I'm looking at this in 2025 and I'm doing the analysis, I give it to Nintendo, and I give it to Nintendo by a fairly good margin. I'm going to say like 60-40 Nintendo, because I do think that the library at the end of the day is superior on the Super Nintendo. And maybe that's just like the type of games I'm looking for as a gamer, right? Like I just prefer those types of games versus Sega's kind of more arcadey twist to their games. I will acknowledge that. And the last thing I'll say is, I don't know if you guys saw any of the articles that were coming out this week, but the Super Nintendo is getting faster with age.
Yes,
I mean, come on.
The audio is getting faster with age. Yeah.
What other piece of technology is improving the older it gets? I mean, you gotta give it to Nintendo.
Yeah, I saw that. I'm gonna do something interesting with this, and I'm kind of split it in two. When it comes down to just the console, the games, Nintendo has the edge. I agree that I don't think it's that close. I do think when you look at the library, there are far more memorable Super Nintendo games out there. And I just think overall that they really found their stride with a lot of their franchises on the Super Nintendo. And not only that, but created genres. We didn't touch on these things, like Super Mario Kart created a genre. Putting Mario in an RPG setting with Super Mario RPG, which then, they moved on to like Paper Mario and things like that. Like they were taking risks with their characters in their games, even though they were playing it safe. Like that's where their risks were happening. Their risks were happening with their characters, with their franchise characters. So I think overall, Nintendo definitely had the edge. Where I will turn around though and give Sega the edge is, here's a company that was competing against this monster, because Nintendo became a monster in the 80s with that NES, and there was nobody who came close to them in the 80s. Nobody did. And the Master System wasn't even close. But what Sega managed to do was they managed to get themselves not only into the market, that they managed to cut into the market share heavily with their console, with their marketing. I mean, I'll never forget, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Just the marketing itself. The fact that you took two words and threw them together. Literally, like I think it was Tom Kalinske who just made it up, president of Sega of America. Blast processing meant absolutely nothing. And they managed to build a small empire on this. So I think they deserve some credit just for becoming that second system and competing with Nintendo and hanging on enough to have two other consoles that followed. So I think you got to give them credit when it comes to that. So I give Sega the credit for the marketing effort and just pushing a system against Nintendo. I think they get the edge there in the 90s. So I think they both had something that worked for them at the end of the day. Nintendo wins overall on console and games. Sega wins in terms of how they manage to push their system out there.
It's reasonable.
That's a very good way to sum it up.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, guys, I mean, I think this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. It was actually really cool to go back and visit this. I will say really quickly before we start to close out, I have one game on the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo that are the same. So like I have a copy of Lion King on Super Nintendo. I have a copy of Castlevania Bloodlines, but not Super Castlevania 4. But the one game that I do have both of is Clue.
Yes.
Clue. Now, there's no reason to compare the two. They're pretty much exactly the same game. I am just a huge Clue fan, so I have both of those. And I thought I would just show that off for a quick second.
I'm going to need you to teach me how to play Clue, because as a child, I learned how to play it wrong, and I never learned how to play it right.
Well, I will teach you how to play it correctly, sir.
All right.
But guys, really, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. And please, please, please tell all my folks out there where they can find you.
You can find us at 2middleagedguys.com. That is 2, the numeral 2, middleagedguys.com. And from that website, you can find us on the socials. You can find links to all of the places to get our podcast. You can find links to our YouTube channel, where we also post all of our podcasts as well. So go to any of those sources, send us a message, listen to some of our episodes, let us know how wrong we are about everything we say, because that's the kind of feedback we're looking for. And we'll probably use your letter on a future episode.
Yes. Also, we're going to be holding a tryout for another middle-aged guy because I've been fired after this episode.
Did you get that memo already, Dave?
Well, yeah, it just popped up.
So just send it to me. I'll throw it in the paper shredder.
Yes, yeah. I never got it.
Yeah,
I keep showing up.
Otherwise, I'll apply if you don't mind. And then for us on this side, you can find us on Facebook.com/RetroGamersPodcast, on Instagram and Blue Sky at RetroGamersPodcast. You can listen to us wherever you listen to podcasts. You can watch us on YouTube and Spotify at RetroGamersPodcast, and you can email us at email@theretrogamers.com. Chris, Dave, it's always a pleasure having you on the show, and please, please come back for another one because I love our conversations.
Anytime.
All right. And with that, we will catch you next time on the Retro Gamers Podcast.